All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm glad you're here and that you are interested in and might support the Center for Pioneer Life. Some of you have been here previously. I recognize your faces. I was explaining to many of you as I walked back the aisle and shook hands that my short-term memory has been crippled by medicine I took for about 10 years. So I have to say, is that you, Mom? I don't remember the name. So previous lectures, we did some of the key questions. So if you have been here before, fine. If you are new, it's a good time to begin. How's the volume doing? Can you tell? Everyone clear? Gwen, can you hear me all right? Terrific. It's a good time to begin because our friend and cousin Fred Young said Christmas is approaching, so why don't you do something about Christmas on the American frontier? That is how our ancestors, maybe on Shoal Creek, celebrated it. So I got started, found it very interesting, and as usual, prepared more material than Mickey's big hand will allow me to present. So I thought I will print some pages in red that I can skip. And Cousin Fred, with his usual wisdom, said, look, why don't you divide it into two parts? We'll do part of it this time, and the rest of it as Christmas approaches next year. So that seems to me to be an amiable way to present it. Now, here's the way the lecture works. I have various major sections. I'm going to call them sections. I might call them parts and slip, but it means the same thing. And under each part, if there are subcategories, whereas the main parts will be 1, 2, 3, 4, the subcategories will be A, B, and C, like that. So that's the way it works. And in lieu of an introduction, which was part 1, I'm finished with that, just having done it impromptu. So I'm ready for part 2, or section 2. So as they say in NASCAR, ladies and gentlemen, start your engines. Are you ready? Part 2 it is, section 2, how it all began. So the question is, and it has sections A and B under it, when did this celebration of Christmas begin? Indeed, when was Jesus born? And that I ask the question means that it's not as simple as you might think. All of us sign documents like checks almost every day. 2018, right? All you've got to do is look at the calendar. Well, things are seldom as they seem. This is not 2018, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. Ordinarily, we say 2018 AD. What does AD mean? Well, I'm impressed. The average person would have said after death. That's roughly right, but erroneous. See, Fred, this is a very learned crowd. I have to do careful research. Anno Domini is a Latin phrase that means the year of the Lord. The word Dominus, Lord. Well, how was it first determined that this is 2018? Well, the first person of whom we have a record to try to calculate that was roughly the year 553. So if it's been 553 years since Jesus was born, errors are going to be possible and very likely. The guy who did it was a monk in Russia named Dionysius. I'm just going to call him Dennis. That's close enough. So what Dennis did was to use the Roman calendar. It began with the founding of Rome. Remember that? Romulus and Remus, raised by a she-wolf. And so what he did is to take Roman rulers, the record of how long each one ruled, and stacked it up until he got to the Emperor Tiberius. The first one to take the title Caesar was Julius. Then there was Augustus. And then, says the Gospels in the New Testament, in the reign of Tiberius, Jesus was born. Well, old Dennis did as well as he could, but he messed up. And he messed up when he came to the Emperor Augustus. Augustus is not a name, it's a title. He was called the August One. And the length of his reign in official records is under the name Augustus. But before that, he ruled 4 years under part of his given name, which was what? Octavian. Right? Yeah. So Dennis was off by 4 years for starters. That's not the worst of it. We turn now to the New Testament. And according to the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 2, it tells us that Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great, the ruler of Judea. Well, when did Herod die? Well, historians have studied this and decided that he was born at least 4 to 6 BC. He died in 4 BC, but you remember the story? It says that he had threatened to kill all the male children in Bethlehem, and the Holy Family, being warned of that, fled to Egypt. Herod is still alive and probably lived there a couple of years until the report came that Herod was dead in year 4. So the best scholarly evidence is that Jesus was born in what, in terms of our calendar, is 6 BC. So this is not 2018, is it? It's probably 2022 according to Dennis, 2026 according to the New Testament. How time flies. Does that mean you're older than you think? No, it doesn't. Well, that's part A. Now comes part B, which is even more surprising and complicated. In what month and on what date was Jesus born? Was it December the 25th, you think? No. Who said no? This is a smart crowd. The biblical writers Matthew and Luke provide no mention of the specific time. The closest mention that we have, or might have, is Luke says that there were shepherds watching over their flocks by night. Well, shepherds are not in the field in the middle of the winter. It gets cold and rainy and snow. So that would probably mean that they're out there guarding their flocks for newborn lambs, protecting them from wolves in the spring, probably April. So that's the closest datum that we have. The celebration of Jesus' birth is played down by early Christian writings. There's no discussion of it for 300 years. In fact, one Christian writer denounces the Roman custom of birth celebrations. No birthdays. He says that's what pagans do. Additionally, there is a Jewish historian at the time of Jesus. His name is Josephus, and he says, quote, "The Torah," that is the Bible, "does not permit us to make festivals at the birth of our children, and therefore to afford occasion for drinking to excess." Birthday parties got kind of wild and rowdy. One writer from this early period mentions various speculations that are made about the month. They vary, he says, from March to April to May. It's the 4th century before the winning date emerges in the Western Roman Empire, December 25. Well, how in the world did that come about? Oh, in a very surprising way that I think some of you may know, since I've learned already. This is a very learned audience. The prevailing view is that December the 25th came about as a very clever attempt to swallow up, co-opt, take over a pagan festival. At the winter solstice, that's the shortest day of the year, the Romans, thank you, had a little celebration. It's called the Celebration of Sol Invictus. Sol is the Latin word for sun, where we get solar. And Invictus means unconquerable. So what happens is, as cold weather approaches, the sun seems to recede a little bit farther each day toward the southwest, doesn't it? The day gets shorter. Well, it looks as if the thing will continue until the sun goes beneath the horizon, and there is total darkness forever. Got to do something. So what do you do at the celebration of Sol Invictus? You meet, you have prayers, and you say in the ritual, "Come back." And guess what happens? It does. Nothing works like success. Now, Christians participated in this. They knew it was pagan. They knew they weren't supposed to do it, but they said, look, if the sun disappears, Christianity or no Christianity, it's all over. So what's the church to do? They decided not to try to fight it head on. So they said, we're going to swallow it up. And so they set the birthday of Jesus at that point. And the earliest record we have is a Christian writer who says, rather than celebrate the rebirth of the Son, S-U-N, can you see where this is going? We ought to celebrate the birth of the Son, S-O-N. Now, the church did that on multiple occasions. Halloween has just passed. There was a celebration annually where it was thought that the spirits of the dead came out of the underworld. And this could be dangerous. They don't recognize you. They're looking for food and beer and water and things like that. So what did the church do? It set at that point a celebration still observed in the church called All Saints' Day. And the pagan variation survives as Halloween. Exactly. So that's how the date came to be set at December 25. Now, there's another reason that it came to be set then, but I see all of this red ink for 2 pages that I'm going to skip. Tune in to radio station Shoal Creek about a year from now, and we can talk about that. I'm finished with section 2. Section 3, the Middle Ages. By the term Middle Ages, one ordinarily means the span of the 5th century through the 15th centuries. That is, from the fall of the Roman Empire that plunged Europe into a period of decline and darkness to the beginnings of the Renaissance. And Renaissance, as you know, means rebirth. The discovery of classical learning. And there is evidence of 2 types of Christmas celebration going on at the time. Although they may have begun at an earlier period, we don't know. Now, if the church sought to transform a Roman celebration by making it Christmas, then remnants of that earlier pagan celebration would have been brought over too. So in addition to such conservative and pious activities as prayer, reading the Gospels, taking vows to lead a better life, there were less serious members of the community who wanted some secular merriment. It's been a long year. People are tired. The harvest is in. There is fresh beer and fresh wine. It's time to party a little bit. So in addition, there were pagan converts to Christianity from places like Germany and Scandinavia. And when they become Christians, they're going to bring along their midwinter celebration practices as well. Thus, one reporter in the 8th century speaks of those who celebrate Christmas by, quote, singing and dancing in the streets in pagan style, heathen acclamations of sacrilegious songs, and banquets by day and night. And some jokers would go about the streets at night, wearing a mask, trying to scare people, sort of a modern Halloween. So one modern source says that the prevailing atmosphere at the time was, quote, raucous, drunken, carnival-like state, including promiscuity and gambling. We can recognize parallels to this type of celebration in the present because there are people who want totally to secularize Christmas, right? And so people will say to me in a store, for example, Happy Holidays. You know what I say to them? Well, and a Merry Christmas to you too. Just to badger them a little bit. On a more neutral level of celebration, there were decorations of evergreens, say sources, ivy and holly, the giving of gifts, and landowners might give their tenants a little bit of money. And they put it in a little bank. And they used a kind of pink clay, and the word for this clay was pig, P-Y-G-G. And for the tenant to get the money out, you broke the little bank. And that's supposed to be the origin of the piggy bank to this day. And you see many of them colored pink. Curiously enough, good continuation. Plays were performed outside the church. Inside, you read the Gospels. People were not educated. They had no way to be. So the primary way of teaching was a pageant outside, a play, a performance. Because the average person could not read and write. Families, if they were economically able, feasted on geese, mince pie, and a special Christmas pudding. Took me a long time to find out what that Christmas pudding was like. This little chat has over 100 footnotes. This is number 27. Boiled wheat, dried fruit, egg yolks, and spices. Considered to be an unusual treat. In the year 1213 A.D., the King of England, King John, you know the Magna Carta man? He threw a little Christmas feast for his nobles, and here's what was on the menu. 200 heads of pork, 1,000 hens, 10,000 salted eels, 50 pounds of pepper, 100 pounds of almonds, along with spices, and by the way, 24 hogsheads of wine. What's a hogshead? It is a big barrel, bigger than the ordinary one, indeed. I can tell you, this is off the record in burning time. The depot at Huntdale used to ship out local Mountain Dew in hogsheads. A hogshead was also used to import cement, and some of them got wet and the cement set up. And if you look at the old store at Huntdale, Finn Peterson's store, I think it was, it is propped up by these round cement barrel-shaped pillars, Earl. Budger Mose Peterson, a distant cousin of mine, liked to show off. He's a big, strong guy, and he would pick up a hogshead of good old Mountain Dew, weighed 500 pounds, by one of those staves and pick it up. And a lot of fellow that couldn't pick up 500 pounds wasn't worth much. An interesting guy that I could talk a little bit about, but that's too much time to take. Slept in his coffin, make sure it was the right size. Stored his liquor in it. Oh, I'll tell you one other story about him. I shouldn't do this. He went on the wagon when he became a Baptist preacher. But after being on the wagon and dry for a while, some of his friends met him in the road, his old drinking buddies. They got him down and poured some whiskey into his throat. A couple of weeks later, he saw them again. He said, "Boys, I believe I'll have you funnel a little bit more of that down me." He was placed on trial by the clergy because it was not proper for a clergyman to do this. And he told a little joke that got on their good side. He said, "Now, brothers, Joshua," do you remember Joshua in the Bible? He said, "Joshua, he made the sun stand still." Do you remember that story? But Moses, he made the moon shine still. Under this section 3, Middle Ages, subsection A, some things that were celebrated that will be carried on until we come to the Appalachian frontier. A, the word Christmas didn't pop up back in the 3rd century. The first time it occurs in Old English, that is Anglo-Saxon, is 1038 A.D. The term is Christus Massae, meaning the Mass of Christ. What is Mass? Well, it comes from the Roman Catholic celebration of the Eucharist, which we Protestants call the Lord's Supper. So what was the feast called before that? In Latin, Dies Natalis, the day of Nativity. Now, perhaps a word should be said about the common American abbreviation XMAS. And people have said, we need to get the Christ back in Christmas. Well, it's right there in front of your eyes, because that X is not an X, as in Xing it out. X is a Greek letter. It's the first letter of the word Christos, which means Christ. So it's right there and does not need to be put back. B, outdoor nativity scenes. This became popularized by St. Francis of Assisi in Italy. Geraldine is just back from there, 1223 A.D., and they quickly spread across Europe. He set up a hay-filled manger outside the church with a live donkey and ox beside it. Initially, there were no human figures. And he said he was doing this to impress upon his viewers that Christ came into the world in poverty and simplicity. Here are his own words, quote, "I want to do something that will recall the memory that Christ was born in Bethlehem, for all to see with bodily eyes the inconvenience of his infancy, how he lay in a manger, and how an ox and a donkey stood nearby." As time passed, various additions were made to the scene. We had Mary and Joseph, the shepherds, and the Magi. Now these Magi, let's do the first slide. This is a famous mosaic. With the passage of time, Magi they're called in the New Testament, but they came to be called mistakenly wise men. They weren't. They came to be called kings. You may recall a Christmas carol that begins, "We three kings of Orient are." The Magi were priests of the old Persian religion. And they were astrologers. They're the ones who saw the star and knew what it meant. Some interesting things about them. You see that sort of peaked cap? That's supposed to be the origin of the witch's hat. You see it Merlin the magician. And you see in Halloween scenes. And you'll also notice that they wear trousers, whereas Greeks and Romans wore togas. You see there are lots of descendants of these Magi in the audience today. Now, with the passage of time, they were given personal names, and an ethnic identity was assigned to each, being inclusive, you know. The text does not even say that there were three of them. Why are there three? Because three gifts are mentioned. Oh, I'm going to burn up some time again because this is interesting. The Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem has on its facade a huge mosaic showing the three Magi. In the 6th century A.D., there was an invasion of Syro-Palestine by the Persians. By then, they were called Parsis. There are still Parsis in Iran. The largest community of them is in Bombay, India now. And the commander of the Parsi army, he was destroying all the Christian churches he could find and killing monks by the thousands, hated Christians. When they got to Bethlehem, he looked up and saw a facade something like that, and he said, "Why, it's some of our boys." And he left it alone. And the church is there to this day. Subsection C under the Middle Ages, caroling outside the church. Now the word carol originally meant a dance with people going in a circle. The singer would stand in the center and the others dance around him, and when they did that inside the church, they liked it so much, the priest said it's disruptive. So he cast them out. No more caroling in the church, so they did it outside. And that is why to this day, carolers go up and down the streets, stopping outside houses to sing. Subsection D, the Christmas Boar's Head Party. That's B-O-A-R. What is that all about? Well, in medieval times, the wild boar was a very fearsome beast. Its meat was relished at banquets because they were slain in the fall when the wild boars were fat on mast. Okay, quiz time. What is mast? M-A-S-T? It's seeds that fall from the forest like chestnuts and acorns, indeed. So these things were very tasty. So Christmas, at that time, Christians began to serve the head of a boar at Christmas time, And this is another illustration of how pagan festivals were baptized and given a Christian spin. Let's do a next slide. There we go. For reasons that I do not understand, this animal became associated with the dead. As one writer has put it, quote, the boar became a symbol of death, which Jesus slew at his resurrection, unquote. It's not surprising then that around the world to this day, not on Shoal Creek or anywhere around, the Boar's Head Festival is celebrated at Christmas. The boar's head with an apple in its mouth is carried in procession while a hymn is sung that contains these verses. The mightiest hunter of them all, we honor in this festal hall. Born of a humble virgin mild, heaven's king became a little child. He hunted down through earth and hell, that swart bore death until it fell. S-W-A-R-T. I think that's a German word that means dark. That sword bore death until it fell. This mighty deed for us was done. Therefore we sing in unison. Very commonly done in England, sometimes in New England. When the wild animal became extinct in England around 1200 A.D., the domestic pig was put in its place. And this is why, even in secular settings, Christmas ham is just as routine as Thanksgiving turkey. Subsection E, the Yule log, Y-U-L-E. The origins of this custom are lost in the mist of time, but it may have had its beginnings in a secular custom to get ready for cold weather by inserting a large log into the heating system. One writer reports about December the 24th, this is the year 1400, quote, a log was brought in at sunset, put into the fireplace, and set aflame to the jubilation of all. By the 15th century, such a ceremony was explicitly associated with Christianity. Why? Because the winter solstice, the shortest day, was identified as Christ's birthday. So you were lighting it in honor of Jesus' birthday. As a matter of fact, in a few places of Europe, Christmas is simply called Seppo, or maybe Chepo, the block, the log. In England, a tenant might feast at his landlord's expense as long as the backlog or the Yule log burned. And I will tell you an interesting story in Yancey County about that very thing a little bit later. If not this time, maybe next December. Subsection F, decorations with ivy, holly, and other greenery. Next slide, please. Here is a picture based on Sol, that winter festival of the Romans, showing Jesus as Sol in winter greenery. As early as the 4th century A.D., there are Roman depictions of greenery being used in connection with Jesus as Sol Invictus. Such decorations continued into the Middle Ages. This apparently is the background for a Christmas carol that all of you know, which goes what? Holly and the Ivy. Well, that too. What else? Deck the halls with... Absolutely. G, and this is the last subsection, Santa Claus. This is a figure so complex in its development as to discourage even trying. He is a composite of St. Nicholas of Myra in the 4th century, who brought gifts to the poor. From him we get the term St. Nick for Santa. Add to this Father Christmas, a figure in 16th century England, plus a Dutch Christmas gift giver called Sinterklaas, S-I-N-T-E-R-K-L-A-S-S. And there is also for the Scandinavians a Norse deity called Odin, who had a long white beard, and he rides a horse across the sky to bring gifts to children. And curiously enough, it's an eight-legged horse, which may have something to do with Santa's 8 reindeer. I'm not sure. All right, goodbye to Section 3. Section 4, oh, now it begins to get interesting. A revolutionary change in the calendar. And this one reverberates to the present day. The calendar that had been used since the time of the Roman Empire under Julius Caesar was called the Julian calendar, based on a 365-day year, which is the amount of time it takes the sun in its orbit to go around the sun, I should say. But they could not measure it exactly. It was 365 and 1/4 days. So what to do to keep things in sync? Every 4 years you throw in a leap year. We still do that. So in the year 1582, Pope Gregory XIII issued a decree for a major correction of the calendar because of that extra 1/4 day. He dropped 11 days from the calendar. So people who went to bed on October the 4th woke up the next morning and it was October the 15th. Thus, December the 25th in the old calendar, the Julian one, became January 5th in the new one, the Gregorian calendar. Enough time has now passed until Old Christmas now falls on January the 7th. It's now called Old Christmas. Several Roman Catholic states put this new system into effect immediately, but others delayed it. Among them, England and her colonies in the New World. Among the last to do so, 170 years later. So Christmas for 170 years was Julian calendar that was now January the 4th. Some Orthodox churches still ignore this calendar correction and continue to celebrate Christmas in the Julian style, December 25th, i.e. January 7th by now. We will talk in a few minutes about how this was rejected by a group of American colonists. You may know that in Scotland, where all those Presbyterians who lived and hated the guts of the Roman Catholics and Anglicans, Christmas was not a holiday until 1980-something. Major Section 5. Post-Renaissance England. That is around 1500 A.D. and after. We turned our attention primarily to England, now called Great Britain. After all, this is the area from which most of the colonists came to the New World, and it's going to affect us. Merry old England continued many of the medieval practices that we have now listed. There were outdoor nativity scenes at churches, outdoor caroling, the Boar's Head Festival, banqueting at home, and the Yule log. Poorer classes might decorate with a bit of greenery that was sold by street hawkers. Maybe get a day off from their employers, and maybe a little extra portion of meal that they had saved up for a special dinner. Here are a few things that were new during this period. A, the Christmas tree. As early as the Roman period, people would decorate public buildings and homes with greenery, primarily ivy and holly. I suppose that this cheered them up a bit amidst the death of all the other vegetation in the world around them. They may even have concluded that such plants were assigned by fertility deities. It was almost inevitable, therefore, sooner or later, that someone would bring inside an entire evergreen tree, not just sprigs of holly and ivy. And I found the following statement in Encyclopedia Britannica, quote, "The use of evergreen trees to symbolize eternal life was a custom among various ancient societies, and it survived their conversion to Christianity," bringing in that sign of eternal life, you see. Then someone must have noticed how at midwinter, when such trees still survived, whereas all the others were dead, this is the holiday of Jesus, who likewise escaped death. Another component should be noted. In medieval plays given in December the 24th, there was a tree of paradise from the Garden of Eden, at which the serpent said, "Don't bother with that." That is the tree that led to the fall of Adam and Eve. It reportedly, this paradise tree was decorated with apples to represent this forbidden fruit. And these red apples, is the model for the later glass balls that grow on Christmas trees. Why in the world was the tree in the garden supposed to be an apple tree? Apples are not native to the area. No one knows for sure. I have an idea. Have I mentioned this before, maybe in a previous lecture? No. I take that as an authentic word. The word for apple in Latin is malum, M-A-L-U-M. It sounds very much like another word, M-A-L-U-S, from which we get the word malice, evil. I think that's why the apple got chosen rather than a kumquat or something else. Decorated trees began at least as early as 1500 in Germany. It's reported that the house of Martin Luther had one, and Lutherans in particular began to favor them. Well, how did they get to England? Well, it came about by the marriage of England's Princess Victoria to a German prince named Albert. Everybody is familiar with Queen Victoria. If for no other reason something displeased her and she said, "We are not amused." Here is an engraving from the 1840s showing the royal family and its tree. And from Albert and Victoria, the practice slowly spread throughout the country. Decorations were added to trees in the form of apples, nuts, dates, paper flowers, and occasionally candles. Now, I read somewhere that candles were affixed to trees in the following way. You took one of the branches, one fairly strong, and sharpened it. And then you needed to affix to it something in which you could put a candle. And they chose an orange. Put the orange under the limb, and then you could stick a candle into the orange. And that's supposed to have some connection with the fact that on Shoal Creek, probably in 1900, a special treat. Fred, probably. Earl, what do you think? An orange? Some people didn't get them. I'll tell you in a little bit how oranges got here before 1900. D. No. This is B. Liquid refreshment and the origin of toasts. How did that happen? As far back as Roman times, you added spices to wine. Gave it a bit of extra flavor, people thought. As early as post-Renaissance England, this was done by placing spice on a bit of charred toast. And you drop that piece of toast into the wine vat. Thus, a character in one of Shakespeare's plays, it's entitled The Merry Wives of Windsor, ordered some spice in wine by saying, "Put a toast in it." Dinners at Christmas featured this as well. And now you know why honoring someone at a celebration is called raising a toast. Or why someone would be called the toast of the town. C. Santa Claus. The modern portrait of this beloved figure is anticipated by a figure called Father Christmas as early as the 1500s in Tudor England. He is pictured as a large fellow dressed in a green or red robe lined with fur. His appearance brings peace, joy, and feasting. Meanwhile, over in Holland, children look forward to a visit from Santa Claus with a long white beard and a red costume. Santa Claus, as we know him today, developed later in the United States. The name Santa Claus first appears in American press in 1773. Section D, now something of a setback. The celebration of Christmas suffered a setback with the rise of the Puritans. In England, a radical branch of Protestantism. You may recall that the separation of the Church of England from Roman Catholicism began with King Henry VIII, he of the 6 wives. He wanted a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. The Pope would not grant it, whereupon Henry declared himself the head of the Church of England, gave himself a divorce. Didn't work out too well. The Puritans thought that this separation in the rise of Protestantism had not gone far enough. They thought that Christmas was a Catholic idea, not mentioned in the Bible, and was a thin veneer over a pagan Roman holiday, Sol Invictus. Furthermore, Christmas celebrations had often degenerated to a time of excessive eating and drinking, accompanied by much gambling with dice and cards. And these rather straight-laced Puritans didn't like that. As one of their leaders put it, it's done to the great dishonor of God. Well, England put an end to the monarchy temporarily with King Charles I, who was executed. And this brought to power the so-called English Commonwealth, headed by a Puritan named Oliver Cromwell. And Parliament, under his leadership, condemned the celebration of Christmas, saying that it had, quote, the trappings of popery and the rags of the beast. In the book of Revelation, you see, there is this poetic character called the beast, number 666. Wish we had time to talk about that. There's a terrible misunderstanding about it. So Christmas has to do with the rags of the beast of Revelation. So the Puritans canceled Christmas. Not only were traditional expressions of merriment strictly forbidden, but shops were ordered to stay open. No closing on Christmas. No churches open on Christmas. No Christian sermons about the Nativity. And preachers who did that were arrested, and soldiers prowled the streets looking for offenders. Now, a new king named Charles II came to the throne, 1660, and the ban was lifted. However, over across the Atlantic in the American colonies, especially in New England, there were the Puritans at Plymouth Bay. Those people who were afraid of witches and gave us the Salem witch trials. They also outlawed Christmas. This negative view of Christian celebration continued even longer in Scotland. The Presbyterians were in a majority there, and they despised anything that was connected with Catholicism and with its stepchild, the Church of England. So the Parliament in Scotland officially abolished Christmas in 1640, and it is only in 1958 that it became a public holiday. Now this is going to have interesting repercussions right here. My mind just flits around, and I thought of the musical. Remember that? Right here in River City. What was the name of that musical? The Music Man? Yep. Scots-Irish who live here still observed Old Christmas. And they did not like this popish holiday called Christmas. I'll tell you what, this is a little off color. But in a rude Scots-Irish cabin, there appeared an Anglican clergyman, dressed in black with a split-tail coat, and wanted to hold a religious meeting. And the Scots-Irish head of the household said, "We don't want any damned Anglican clergymen in their black coats anywhere around here." So hit the road. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we come to the American colonies. A word should now be said, and we're approaching the end of this segment, about a famous work by an English writer named Charles Dickens. Does anyone know his famous poem, famous story? It's called A Christmas Carol. What do you know from the Christmas Carol? There's some famous things you should know. Anybody remember any? Scrooge. Bah, humbug. What else? Tiny Tim, The Ghost of Christmas Past. Well, what this story did was very influential. It emphasized family gatherings, seasonal food, dancing, and the generous spirit of sharing.
And a day off.
And a day off, indeed. You're absolutely right. And the greeting, Merry Christmas, which continues to this day. I'm going to do one more little bit, and then we will quit and save it for next year. Section 6, Colonial America. how Christmas was observed in the British colonies varied along the Mason-Dixon line. To the north were the Puritans, the Pilgrims, and to a lesser extent the Quakers, who opposed celebration of Christmas. This continued those Puritans who outlawed it in England. Now, the so-called war on Christmas is illustrated by this notice from the city of Boston, Geraldine. 1659. Can you read it? The observation of Christmas having been deemed a sacrilege, and the exchanging of gifts and greetings, dressing in fine clothing, feasting, and similar satanic practices is hereby forbidden, with the offender liable to a fine of 5 shillings. That was about $15 in modern money, and a pretty hefty sum back then. Down south, in the English colonies like North Carolina, it was a different matter. The Anglican Church still had some influence, and the wealthier party celebrated by hunting. Any of you remember neighbors getting together and hunting poor Mr. Rabbit in the meadow on Christmas Day? I do. Yeah, you do, right?
My wife does, I'm sure.
Special meals, parties, visiting friends, in addition to church services. At home, Christmas decorations generally consisted of holly and ivy and a sprig of mistletoe. Here is an example in a painting for the year 1798, a Christmas ball in the residence of George Washington in Virginia. You can see Brother George there at the left edge. It was this very sort of thing, suggesting secular revelry that did not focus directly on the Christ event, that would drive a Puritan crazy. One of their most influential leaders, named Cotton Mather, said the following, quote, I'm sorry, Geraldine, I keep blocking your view.
I've got it right here.
That's true. Cotton Mather said, quote, the feast of Christ's Nativity is spent in revering, dicing, carding, masking, and in licentious liberty, by mad mirth, by long eating, by hard drinking, by lewd gambling, and by rude reveling. Unquote. The Puritans frowned on what may be called mixed dancing, as is shown here, because they said it might lead to fornication. Is that why you said here? Mention must now be made of the most memorable and lasting contribution of this period, a poem written in 1837 for his children by a guy named Clement Clark Moore. Can any of you guess what that poem was? Yes. A Visit from St. Nicholas, better known by its opening lines, "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse." It is in this poem that for the first time we read of Santa as a jolly old elf who was dressed all in fur, with a beard and a mustache, and with smoke from his pipe encircling his head like a wreath, who arrives on Christmas Eve rather than Christmas Day, and who carries toys in a bundle flung on his back and has a sleigh pulled by 8 reindeer. Before that, there was only 1 reindeer. And it wasn't Rudolph. This has been called arguably the best known verse ever written by an American. Now, at the same time, there was a cartoonist named Thomas Nast, another American, commonly read newspaper called Harper's Weekly Magazine, began publishing in 1859, and Nast drew images from the poem, and here is his image of Santa. Sounds and looks familiar? And it is Nast who created the idea of Santa's workshop at the North Pole. That's the end of section 6 and the end of what I'm going to say now. What is section 7? Appalachia. That's where it gets interesting. And beyond that, I'm going to talk about, just as a little preview, let me look over here. And this is way over in section 9. Things to come. A few concluding interesting facts. The first appearance of Santa in department stores was in Massachusetts. Several locations, several countries have claimed that Santa's headquarters is in their territory. Alaska, Canada, Norway, Greenland. When did writing letters to Santa begin? Each of these has a little description. Well, that was 1912. In 1909, this is the latest status I could find, 2 million such letters addressed. And some countries have charities answer the letters. Santa's reindeer, 8 of them. When did NORAD begin reporting to children that Santa's sleigh had been sighted on radar? 1955. When was the earliest Christmas card sent? Well, 1843, a run of 2,000. It showed a family celebrating Christmas, toasting with wine. It included a little girl, looks like she's about 5 years old. This caused a furor. Children being given alcoholic beverage. I'll skip a few others. Getting a lump of coal in one's stocking. Santa's list, he's making a list, he's checking it twice. Santa says, ho, ho, ho. You may be aware that in Australia, it's suggested that Santa should not say ho, 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 because in African American lingo, ho has another meaning. Demeaning to women. So Santa in Australia says, ha, ha, ha. Now, I could tell you a joke, but I won't, about why Tiger Woods is different from Santa. Have any of you heard that joke? I will not repeat it.
Can I ask a question?
Sure. I thought you were going to say, go ahead and tell it. No. This is my wife, Judith, by the way.
So let's go back to time. And you're talking about people living up here. They're spread far apart. You may or may not have a church nearby. I'm sure you don't have a calendar from the local garage on the wall. How did people know when things were?
Sometimes they mark things on the wall. You made a calendar. This is December.
How do you know it's December?
Because you've been doing this and learned it from your fathers and grandfathers. And so besides,
somebody had to come in with a calendar.
Old country stores, trading posts had calendars.
And but you have people who couldn't read. I'm talking about people living
well,
here when they first came.
You can figure enough to figure 1843.
We follow the moon as the sun and the moon. The moon gave them a pretty good idea.
You could do a lunar calendar, yes.
Yeah, the lunar calendar is quite different because it's a little brief.
But if you put it together with another source, you can get you know where you are, at least from the sun, the length of day, length of night.
Sure, you kept records as American Indians did. This is the first moon, the second moon, the harvest moon in the fall, and so forth. My mind flits when I'm talking. My mind flits and thinks of a dozen things. I can't tell you about that. One of my friends told me about a calendar he saw 150 years ago. One picture was a girl holding a kitten, another a boy holding a rooster. Do any of you know this little story?
Yes.
I can't really repeat it.
Well, it's real.
It was about what it is that you wash with ivory soap. Oh, this man figured it out.
Wash your mouth out?
That too. Some things get washed in ivory soap, other things in any old thing. Anyway, what else? Mrs. Santa Claus, when did she appear? Well, that's the end of a little preview of next year, courtesy of the Center for Pioneer Life. I'm finished. Are there things about which you want to talk, or have you sat long enough and need to give your mind and other body parts a little rest?